Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and this is Chemistry Essentials, video 55. It's on chemical and physical processes. If I were to take this table salt and break it apart into sodium metal and chlorine gas, I'd be breaking those ionic bonds. And so this would be a chemical process or a chemical change. However, if I were to take water and simply boil it, I wouldn't be breaking those covalent bonds in the water molecule itself. I'd simply be pulling on those intermolecular forces, pulling on it enough so that I could get it to change from a liquid to a gas. And so that would be a physical process. But there's a gray area in the middle. If I were to add the salt to the water, it could either be a physical process as we dissolve it or a chemical process. And so before we get to that, we really have to understand the difference between intermolecular and intramolecular forces. Intermolecular, remember, are going to be between molecules. So between the yellow and the yellow would be an intermolecular force. Those are going to be things like dipole-dipole forces, induced dipole forces. What are intramolecular forces? Those are going to be within the molecule itself. Those are going to be the bonds, the covalent and those ionic bonds. And so if we're looking at processes, we can put it in one of two categories. In a physical process, what we're doing is we're breaking and forming those intermolecular forces between the molecules. And so that usually ends up in a change of state from a solid to a liquid to a gas. In a chemical process, however, what we're doing is breaking and forming those bonds. And so that's how we tell the difference between these two processes. But there's a gray area in the middle. And in that gray area, if we take an ionic compound and dissolve it in water, those ions will be separated. And as they're doing that, we're not actually breaking those bonds. They're staying as an ion. We're just moving those apart. And so you could argue that this is a physical process or this is a chemical process. And so let's start with a chemical process. In a chemical process, we're breaking those bonds. And so in the combustion of methane, we're combining it with oxygen, and you can see here that we're breaking those covalent bonds. We're breaking the bonds between the carbon and the hydrogen and oxygen itself. And so that's going to usually end up in producing changes in color, odor, gas, heat, maybe precipitate. This is a bunch of iron 3 reactions, and you can just see the remnants of all of these in these reactions itself. You can see that we're breaking those bonds and then reforming those bonds again. That's a chemical process. In a physical process, however, what we're doing is simply pulling on those intermolecular forces that are holding the molecules together. And that's just going to give us a change in state. Like when we boil that water, we're heating up those water molecules, we're breaking those hydrogen bonds between the two, and then we're starting to change it into a gas. And so in the gray area, however, we can take something like water, which is a dipole, and we can start to separate all the ions in sodium chloride. So when you put salt in water, it simply dissolves. Now, are we technically breaking these ionic bonds? No, we're not converting it back into sodium metal and chlorine gas. What we're doing is just ushering them away. And so if we take that water, what it really does is it surrounds the chlorine ions like this. And so what do we have? We have all this chlorine ion, and it's attracted to the positive part of the water molecule, or the hydrogen portion of that partial charge. Likewise, if we take that sodium ion, it's going to be the negative portion of the dipole that's actually going to usher that away. And so you could argue that since these are intermolecular forces, that this is simply a physical process. But if you were to measure those bonds that you're breaking, they're much harder than most covalent bonds. And so you could argue that this is a chemical process. And so again, did you learn to determine if a process is a chemical change, a chemical process, a physical process, or could be classified as both? I hope so, and I hope that was helpful.